Welcome to Just Thinking. This is Mary Greendale. The title of this show grew out of a lifetime of curiosity about many different subjects. Some local, some global, and some in between. For each show, I will open with my thoughts and then bring on guests who explore the subject in greater detail. I hope the show inspires healthy discussions on camera and among viewers. To me, the sky's the limit when we are just thinking. Hi, I'm Mary Greendale with Just Thinking, and we are having a conversation this morning between me and the Executive Director of the Gun Owners Action League of Massachusetts. The topic is guns, no surprise there, I suppose. And my goal, no pun intended, is to just get some facts behind the subject before I explore further in the same subject with other people. So for the moment, welcome, Jim. Thank you very much.
Just for the moment?
Yeah, just for the moment.
Okay.
Thank you. I know you came all the way down from Newburyport, and it must have been kind of a hike, given the not just the distance, but the travels.
We still have power, so it's been it's okay. You know, we're kind of doing our thing, but taking care of relatives and neighbors and making sure everybody's safe, because luckily it didn't get that cold. So
yeah, no, that's true. Most of Holliston has been without power at one point or another. Knock on wood, I've been lucky. I didn't lose power at all. But at any rate, so I wanted to start at a very, very basic standpoint, and you and I started to get into the conversation at the beginning when I said, boy, it's really hard to come up with that phrase that says you're pro-gun, you're pro-whatever, you're an advocate, you're the whatever. It's hard to get that phrase so that it isn't too narrow. And you came up with what GOAL uses as a terminology, and you call it...
Yeah, we're actually a civil rights advocacy organization, because the right to defend yourself is a civil right. It's enumerated in the Bill of Rights. And it's kind of a new look, if you will. And I really get irritated when some of my colleagues use the term gun rights, because we don't advocate for guns. We advocate for people and their civil rights. And it's kind of a new way of having the discussion, because one of the things is we get hung up on the thing and not the human element. And whether we're dealing with people who are just exercising their civil rights, or we're trying to solve problems like suicides or crime, it's the human element that's the most important thing. It's not the item. So we don't get hung up on calling ourselves gun rights advocates. It's civil rights.
And my reaction to that was, ooh, ouch, because that's basically saying, you know, the right to education if you're a little black kid in some community, the right, the right to freedom of the speech and all of those other things. Those kinds of rights we think as being very personal. And somehow I have to admit, gun rights feels a little bit different, okay?
Yes.
But let's just go with, there are 350 million, some estimates, of guns that are already out amongst us. Right, okay, so we've got 350 million guns already available. And whatever laws or regulations we put in, are we going to be able to affect those guns? Is it possible to create a regulation that would affect those guns? And I can't think of a way to do that.
Yeah, I mean, when people talk about, banning the Second Amendment and banning guns, it's not practical. I don't even want to picture what the logistics would look like. So, again, we always try to focus on the human element. And when, especially in the last few years, when I discuss gun issues, I break them down into three categories, because they all take different answers. Accidental deaths, homicides, and then mental health is predominantly suicide, but can also be what we saw in Parkland, which is somebody with severe mental health. And all three take very different approaches and very different solutions. So it can't be just one size fits all. For instance, if we suddenly, which we don't, but if we suddenly had issues at our ranges during our safety instruction or whatever, where suddenly accidents started popping up, we would address that entirely different as we would. We have a severe mental health issue on our hands. How are we going to help these people not commit suicide? Totally different answers. So we have to break those into different categories to make sure we're addressing the problem at hand.
The issue of Parkland, the young man that was involved as the shooter, was definitely disenfranchised, definitely marginalized, definitely thrown aside, basically. Okay, so I think about him too, because we lost 17 people, 14 kids. We also lost him, but we lost him a long time ago. We lost him a long time ago. And so the question is, what does your organization say about finding those people, catching those people, helping those people? What's the answer?
You know, a good friend of mine had a great observation after Newtown. And a friend of mine used to be a teacher back in the 70s, what they used to call teacher corps, which is you went into the inner cities and you dealt with, you know, a lot of people that were hardcore. And he had a great observation. He said K through 12, for the most part, we're following these kids, maybe giving them some counseling, there's some treatment, there's some guidance. As soon as we hand them a diploma, they're off the map. Yeah. And if you look at the ages, the Aurora, Colorado, Newtown, Parkland, and probably others, they're all about that 3 to 4 years out of high school. And his observation was more than likely, once they graduate, they're off the grid, they grow dark, they grow silent, very to themselves, they start getting on these internet websites on, you know, the world is to fault, and then they eventually snap. So how do we reach those people? Now, after Newtown, we were talking about this off air, I did so many interviews that I started to get emails from perfect strangers around the country begging for mental health care for their family member, loved one, whatever the relationship was. And it always remarked to me how bad things are out there with mental health that they're contacting me. Somebody who's not in the field, not, you know, wasn't necessarily a mental health advocate. I am, but, you know, that's not my job. So I looked at things and said, you know what, there's got to be a better way. And if you talk to these experts, which I have, they will tell you that people with vast ranges of mental health issues are not violent. They're not a danger to themselves or others, maybe to themselves sometimes but they're not violent. So we need to treat those people differently than we do the next potential monster. And one of those things we're going to have a hard time doing as a society, there's that very tiny percentage of people that probably, no matter how much care and treatment we give them, can't walk among us. Right. But the problem is all those facilities were shut down in the 70s because they were horrible facilities. But rather than fix them, they shut them down. So there's no place for these people to go on a full-time basis. So what they do now is usually when somebody brings them in, a family member, they drug them up and then just release them, maybe after 2 or 3 days. So once they're out on their own again, maybe they don't take their meds, maybe they're going back into that dark hole. And we see what happened in Parkland. We see what happened in Newtown and Aurora. So it's one of those things that as a society, we're going to have to come with grips with. And it's not going to be easy. I've talked to state reps and senators over the years about this, and they said just Massachusetts, if we handle mental health the way it should be handled, it's going to make the Big Dig look like a picnic. So it's going to be billions and billions of dollars. Sad
testament. Right there.
Yeah.
I mean, just in terms of how big the problem is.
It's huge.
So I can remember it was actually in 1986 when we deinstitutionalized. And I was working in the state Senate at that point in time. And I remember a father calling up and saying, I'm 80 whatever, my wife has died, I have cancer, my son's been in Worcester State Hospital for 50 years. Where's he going to go?
Yeah.
And the bottom line was, got no idea, he's going to be on the street. And, you know, small comfort to that man and small comfort to the patient. So if, I guess, to get back to the guns, how does this all relate to guns? We've got the population out there, ill-defined in terms of scope, but a big population of people who may have access to guns and at the same time have mental health issues. So how do we get those guns away from those people?
Well, in Massachusetts, the systems are already in place. So it's kind of an interesting discussion for the rest of the country. But in Mass, there are several things already in place. Police chiefs have an extraordinary authority in Massachusetts to revoke a license or suspend on a moment's notice. And they can go to your house hand you a piece of paper, your license has been suspended or revoked. We need to have the guns. If they refuse to give them, I've talked to many police chiefs about this, even in just the past couple of weeks, and they said I would station an officer at that house, I would go to the courtroom, get a warrant, come back, and I can take the guns right away. There's also something called a wellness visit, where if you're a neighbor, you're a friend, maybe you just talked to your whoever, uncle, aunt, and you're in another state, and you say, whoa, there was a lot of things that were said that just isn't right. That's not the aunt that I know of, something's wrong. You can call the local police, tell them what's going on, and they will conduct what they call a wellness visit. They can go into the house. They don't have the right to search, but they can knock on the door, go in the house, make sure everything's okay, and if it's not okay, they can do one of two things. If it's substance abuse, they can do what's called a Section 35, and I think it's also 31 of Chapter 123, where the courts can have you put under observation for up to 72 hours. Mm-hmm. And if during that time the doctors feel that this is a much bigger problem, and not just one of temporary, had too much to drink, said something stupid. There's also, when they do the wellness visit, if they think there's something in the mental health realm, and sometimes those two cross a lot because people self-medicate, mm-hmm. They will do what's called a Section 12, and they can be held for 72 hours for mental health observation. And within that 72 hours, the doctors can report to the judge and say, nah, this was temporary, they'll be all right with some counseling, or we may want to take a longer look at this person. And in that case, the judge can, I think it's in 30-day increments, can hold the person against their will. Now, once you're held against your will in Massachusetts, you automatically lose your license. And it's virtually impossible
to carry.
License to carry. And it's virtually impossible to get back. There are ways, but it never happens. So there's all of these things already in place in Massachusetts. One of the things that I was surprised at, for the mental health issue, that Massachusetts doesn't have a suicide hotline. When you see the signs around or billboards, it's the Samaritans. It's not the Department of Mental Health or the Department of Public Health in Mass. And it really surprised me because I think there's some work that can be done there that if we set up a state hotline, and you always got to be careful with police, even though they have the authority and they do a good job. Some people, when they see the police walk in the door, are really reel back, but I'd like to see something set up where not only people who are feeling in that position where they're suicidal, but families or friends could call and say, hey, I got a loved one, I'm really concerned, they're saying things that I don't want to hear. I mean, pick a scenario. I mean, you lose a child to cancer, you go through a brutal divorce, you lose your spouse, whatever it might be. What can I do to help? And in that case, there has to be some education both for the person suffering and the families. Because if we just take the gun away, we know, especially in Mass, that suicides by hanging and suffocation are almost triple that of guns. So they're going to find other ways. So there has to be a support system put in place, but also we need a better name, but I call it with the family do a home sweep to show them or provide education of other means that might be a danger. How much medication is in the house? Do they have the ability to hang themselves? That's a tough one to stop, but there are things you could probably do. So it has to be all-encompassing. It just can't be about the gun. Now, one of the problems we've run into, I actually sit on a commission for what they call distressed person, and it was established in the 2014 bill that Cole helped get passed. Where the stumbling block comes is, whether it's the gun or the driver's license or whatever it might be, maybe it's a professional, practice medicine. People who, if you talk to the experts again, people who are in these ways will hide it very well. Mm-hmm. When do you make the decision to give them back their driver's license, give them back their gun license, give them back their medical license? Because even experts can be fooled by these people. That, right. They'll come to you and say, no, I'm fine, great, thanks for the therapy, I'm good to go. Some people who commit suicide never show any signs, so there's no intervention. So it's a very complicated subject that we need to go far beyond what we're looking at.
What is it about what we do in Massachusetts that is so awful to the people who are big in the NRA in other states? What is it that we do that is so wrong to them?
The Massachusetts gun laws overall are some of the most convoluted gun laws in the country. And they're not effective, as opposed to what people think. That's just a false narrative. Why do you say that? Because ever since the gun laws were passed in 1998, gun crime has actually gone through the roof. It hasn't decreased. The accidents haven't changed. Back in 1998, the average gun death by accident was 2. It's still 2. And those are usually criminals. They're not the good people that are licensed. Homicides with guns are up since 98, almost, actually now over 30%. And suicides by guns after 98 did drop a tick, but they've come back up. But again, suicide by hanging has skyrocketed since the year 2000. So we really didn't do anything. We talked about the gun, but we didn't address the person, the human element. So the reason that when people talk about, well, we have the second to the lowest gun death rate, is because they include the suicide rate. In Massachusetts, if you look at all suicides, all attempts, all kinds, Mass is the second to the lowest in the country. Number 1 is New York, and it's because of our access to health care. The more rural the state is, the higher the suicide rate is, period, not just with guns. You know, if you're a rancher in Wyoming compared to somebody who might be within the Beltway here, you stand, even though it's not good, you stand a better chance of getting some kind of help in Mass than you do in a very rural area in the country. Mm-hmm. So it's artificially low when people get to talk about that, but actually it's not. Now, as far as the laws themselves, there's actually a retired police chief that publishes a 400-page book and gives 8-hour seminars on how to begin to understand the Massachusetts gun laws. We actually have a 4-hour class at Goal, but we don't cover the criminal laws, just what you need to know to be a lawful gun owner. And part of the problem is that throughout the presentation, the questions we get, we have no answers to. We've been doing this for 20 years and we still have no answers to. There's just too much gray area. And you can tell, as a gun owner, the people who wrote the laws didn't know anything about guns or gun owners. One simple, for instance, just to start is, we have 2 basic licenses in Massachusetts, license to carry and a firearms identification card. Firearms identification card is only valid for what we call non-high capacity rifles and shotguns. Side-by-side shotgun, bolt-action rifle, whatever it might be. So the problem is, under Massachusetts law, firearms legally means handgun. It's not the generic term that we would use. But you can't own a handgun on a firearms identification card. So, I mean, that's just the start. Yeah. And other things like transportation and storage, everybody thinks a trigger lock is what you use. Trigger lock is good for the home for a handgun, but not in your car. So if you're not carrying the gun in your car, it's not under your direct control. It has to be unloaded and locked in a container. If it's a non-high capacity rifle and shotgun, if you're just going from your house to the skeet field, you don't need to secure it, just unload it, and you can have it wherever, your trunk, in your back seat. But on your way, if you stop to go into a store to get a cup of coffee, now you're not transporting it, you're storing it. And different laws are now intact. So it's all of these things that make it so difficult to be a lawful owner. I actually coined the phrase the other day about the bump stocks that we've reached, I called it regulatory fatigue syndrome. Because the average person who's a gun owner and wants to do everything legally legitimately has no hope of following all the laws. And some of them start to give up, and that's not what we want to see. We want everybody to do everything lawfully and safely, but if they stand no chance, they start to get fatigued about it and give up. So,
but let's go to Florida. Mm-hmm. We've got a chronic argument about, you know, confiscation of guns, not selling guns, blah, blah, blah. Those kids that are out articulating today that were related to, literally or just by, you know, what they've seen and heard and so forth, they're out calling for certain changes. Mm-hmm. How are those changes related to what we do in Massachusetts? Are any of those things that we already have?
Most of them we already have in Massachusetts. The biggest one is going to be mental health. You know, why did he slip through the system? In 2014, we actually worked hard to try to tighten up the NICS checks because Massachusetts wasn't complying with the mental health aspect. So we worked hard in what we call Fix NICS to get Massachusetts up to speed in getting the information to NICS. How this person was able to buy a gun is beyond me. With his mental health issues, there's no way he should have been legally able to buy a gun.
Okay, and there is a slide that I'm going to show now, or I'm going to ask the staff to show. It's entitled Partisan Gap in Views of Concealed Carry, and it should be noted that we have concealed carry here in Massachusetts.
Actually,
yes.
you can only carry concealed.
Yeah.
You can't carry openly in mass.
Yeah.
And
So
that's not the gun laws, that's the assault laws. Because if you carry openly and somebody gets scared, they can actually file an assault charge against you. So there's nothing in the gun laws that says you can't carry openly. It's the assault laws.
where do they fall?
The assault laws?
Yeah, in a whole different book and chapter.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So the slide that we have here shows that on what they're trying to show with these dots is the comparison between Republicans and Democrats, or leaning one way or the other, about different measures that we could take in gun policy. So the first one is promoting the mentally ill from purchasing guns. And there is zero difference in this survey between Republicans and Democrats. This is unanimous. Everybody agrees that we should be doing this. But we can't, because this comes with a huge, huge price tag.
Massive price tag. And that's been the problem ever since I really started to get into this discussion about mental health, is it's going to be enormous, because there's, and you get, and this is one of the things we can talk about later, but the so-called ERPO bill, the extreme risk bill, why I hate it so much isn't the gun issue, it's actually the mental health issue, because it treats people who have a very curable, well, cure is a tough word, mental health, but a very treatable crisis with a support system, some counseling, some love and care, as they treat them the same as identifying the next potential monster. We cannot allow that to happen. And if in that bill too, if we are identifying the next monster, all we're doing is taking their legal gun away and sending them home. That's absurd. So that bill, if it was completely redrafted, we might be behind it, but right now, there's no way we're going to get behind it.
Why don't we talk about what the bill does?
Sure.
So it's the one that's basically, is this the same as the red flag that's basically saying?
Yeah, they kind of changed the name.
Yeah, so if we have any reason to believe, we being government, that you are a risk to the public, and you have some guns that we know you have. Of course, it doesn't account for all of the people who may have guns that we don't know about.
Because we don't have any legal problem, right?
But anyway, so if we know you have a problem, we're saying that through some sort of legal process, we can go in and take your gun away.
Right.
Do we do anything else while we're there?
We darn well better. Because,
but does the bill call for it to do anything else?
No, and that's one of the big problems we have with it.
Okay.
Let's take it a piece at a time. There's two big pieces. So let's say we're talking about somebody who's going through a temporary crisis in their life. Like I said, name a scenario, right? You're going to drag them through a court process. You're going to embarrass them. You're probably going to exacerbate their mental health issue, because now it's public. And you're going to label them an extreme public safety risk. And you're going to take away their civil right and then just send them home. Now you've made matters worse. You've sent them home with no counseling, no support system, no help.
The bill doesn't call for any of that.
It tells them to give them pamphlets. You know, that's not a solution. So we have a much better system in place now to handle things quietly and with dignity, where people can go in and do a wellness visit and say, hey, let's get you some help. You know, it doesn't have to go through a court system. We're going to make sure that, listen, we're going to hold on to your guns, but we're also going to look at other things, and that's what we want. We want you to look at everything that something, you know, like I said, too much medication in the house, you know, is there 6 gallons of vodka in the house, whatever it might be that's going to hurt them. Now, let's look at the potential monster. And that, again, that's a real small percentage, but they are there. There are people that no matter how much help you give them, they're not safe.
Yep.
This bill identifies them, takes their legal gun away, and sends them home. That's absurd.
How are you drawing the distinction?
Well, that's it. If we are truly trying to identify the next monster, then
he's still getting the same treatment as this person did, so he's getting a pamphlet too.
Right.
But he's gone through a court process.
And goes home.
And might have the public embarrassment and all the same stuff that would happen to the guy who's not the psychopath or whatever.
But the one who's the potential monster, we're letting go? Can they be a doctor? Can they work in a school? Can they drive a tanker truck? I mean, there's 1,000 different things. If we truly believe not this person who we can help, but this person who is clinical, we can't let them go and walk amongst us. It's just not possible. And that's going to be a very hard one for society to come to grips to, again, that there are people who just simply can't walk amongst us. And by letting that person go, if you thought they were mad at the world before, drag them through that court process and then let them go again.
Okay, but let's back up, okay?
Yep.
Convince me that that really fundamentally your big concern is not about just taking the gun away. I mean, is that really what, in other words, is this rest of this discussion just a smokescreen because you just don't want to see anybody have that gun taken away?
No, we've actually worked very hard with the legislature for years at GOAL, and that's one of the things that a lot of people who just hear our name and suddenly say, oh, you want everybody to have guns. Not even close. I mean, in 2014, we worked very hard on that bill at the State House. Yeah, we didn't like everything, but we actually successfully came out with a bill. And we were the ones that actually put in the legislation. For instance, our bill was in that bigger bill about trafficking guns across state lines, trafficking guns to prohibited persons. We passed in that legislation about breaking and entering into homes to steal guns and then give them to other people. Breaking and entering into retailers, manufacturers, wholesalers of guns, and then giving to other people. We actually passed a bill, and we've seen this happening even just recently, called the Deceptive Weapons Bill, that if you're committing a violent crime, not just walking around, but committing a violent crime with anything that's supposed to convey the presence of a gun, you can be charged as if you had a gun. We just filed a bill 3 weeks ago now through Representative Joe McKenna that taking all those laws we got passed in 2014, and then just recently the State House has upgraded the drug trafficking laws, that if you're convicted of drug trafficking and gun trafficking, you're going to jail for the rest of your life. It's not somebody got caught with a joint or didn't do the right paperwork.
Right.
These are hardcore people. You know, we also filed a bill through Representative Kate Campanelli about trying to help predominantly women, but not all, victims of domestic violence.
Yep.
So Gun Owners actually has done a lot of work to make sure that guns don't end up in the wrong hands, but the thing is, we want to make sure that everybody understands it's not, especially with mental health, it can't be just the gun. It has to be all-encompassing, because if you don't, you miss the mark, and we're going to lose that person eventually.
Okay, so going to the NRA, how do they feel? Do you know how they feel about that issue, the mental health, the laws that you could be put in place?
Yeah, I suspect they're actually working on that now. I don't know for sure, but that's kind of what I'm getting the gist of, is they're trying to work that out now. Now, an interesting hurdle is not the gun owners, it's the mental health community. And when we were working on the NICS fixes back in 2014 to make sure that the mental health information was getting in, it was really the mental health community that said, we really don't want government involved in this for any purpose. And it's because of the stigma that comes with mental health, no matter what level you're at. And we did see that in a microcosm back during the Obama administration, when they were trying to help the veterans with PTSD, that all of those people that started coming forward for help were suddenly starting to lose their rights. And that's the last thing the mental health community wants to see. We want to encourage people to go forward. So they're kind of a bigger hurdle than we are in some of this stuff, and I understand why, because it's, you know, privacy, and I'm sure HIPAA has to be involved at some point. I'm not an expert on it by any chance, but so I'm sure some of those things are being worked out right now.
So I'm going to ask the staff to put back up the slide that was the partisan chart. Okay, so the first one, the preventing the mentally ill from purchasing guns. we're going to assume, and we know how dangerous that is, we're going to assume that there are pockets of places and people having conversations around the country, but maybe not one big, giant conversation anywhere that's trying to pull it all together.
True. Sure.
Okay?
Yeah.
But that's one where the Republicans and the Democrats can actually agree. Another one is banning gun purchases by people on no-fly or watch lists. Now, this strikes me as being sort of that no-brainer kind of thing. What is the issue here? There's
no due process. There's absolutely no due process because the no-fly list is secret, and the FBI will not share it. So if you're on the no-fly list, you probably won't even know you're on the no-fly list until you try to get on a plane. And then if you ask, wait a minute, why can't I fly? There's no due process once you get involved. So that's one of the big things. I mean, when Ted Kennedy was alive, it was always the standard answer. Ted Kennedy was on the no-fly list. So how do you get there? More importantly, how do you get off of there? And nobody can answer those questions. So, and the FBI has flat out said, we're not sharing this information because we don't want people to know we're watching them. So that becomes, it's a great soundbite, I understand it, but when you look at the logistics of it, it's nearly impossible.
So this one is just what you said, a soundbite. Yeah. This is just a blue smoke and mirrors kind of question. Doesn't really change anything. So the first one is humongously complicated, requires a bazillion dollars that we have no idea where it would come from. The second one is unachievable because government, basically FBI, is saying it ain't going to happen, so it ain't going to happen.
Well, I do have one idea for some money. How about government, no matter which side you're on, who you represent, stop suing each other every day? Imagine how much money that's costing us.
Well, maybe we'll think about a show about that.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, so then the next highest one on that list is the background checks for private sales and at gun shows. This has a disparity of 13% between R&D. Okay, so and what is the issue here?
Well, Massachusetts, we already have that. You can do, in Massachusetts, you can do 4 what we call private transfers a calendar year. So you would have to be licensed. I'm licensed. We have to go on, there's an online portal. You go on, you put our information, your information, the gun information in. Gun shows predominantly here in Massachusetts, you're only going to see licensed retailers. Rarely do you see a private person. It's not worth it to them to rent a table because they can only sell a few guns. So licensed retailers, and they have to go through all the same systems that they would if they were sitting in their store. So they have to fill out the state form, the federal form, go on the state MERC system, go on the NICS system for the federal, all the same background checks, all the same paperwork that we have to do here. Now around the country, what they're saying is that while too many people who are not licensed retailers are at these gun shows just selling guns without background checks, I honestly don't know how prevalent that is because the ATF watches that pretty good, and they are at all these gun shows. I know even here in Massachusetts, I'll give them all the credit in the world, the Massachusetts Firearms Record Bureau actually started setting up a table at the shows because the laws are so complex. Or if you had a problem with your license, it wasn't coming up right, you go over to the table, they'll help you out. That's the way the system should work. So if the ATF is watching and you start selling, you get into what they call the business of selling guns, they're going to crack down pretty hard. Now, the other issue is the logistics of it, especially if you're out in, using the Midwest states. You're a rancher and you want to trade your friend a shotgun for his lawnmower. How are you going to do that? It's virtually, they're not going to travel 200 miles to the nearest city to do a background check so they can, do that trade. So the logistics in this country for that kind of thing is virtually impossible. I don't know how they would do it. Canada tried it for years, spent billions trying to do it, didn't do anything. So.
Okay. Real anti-gun folks want to see registration of guns. Let's tackle that one, and we'll explore those among us who are survivalists, who honestly believe that they want to be prepared to overthrow protect themselves from being overthrown or taken over by the government. There are people who believe that and live that way. We've got 350 million guns out there already. Among those guns are the high-capacity AR-15 and all of the others, and we'll talk about that in a minute. They're already out there, okay? Probably in the hands of many people who feel very strongly about defending their civil rights and the right to own those weapons and so forth. How do we even have a conversation? How do we even start a conversation? Right here, trying to get ready to start having conversations about guns right here locally, go on Facebook. There's blowback. If you say, hey, I'm I have an AR-15, and even if it's all fully licensed, and everybody knows about it, and it's I've done everything right. I own an AR-15. All of a sudden now, you're defending yourself on Facebook. So most people don't bother. So you don't ever really get the conversation going.
Yeah.
What do we do with that?
Well, one of the things that's the problem is in Massachusetts since '98, the government, through its laws, has forced us to hide who we are. So the general public doesn't see the average person with a rifle or shotgun or even a handgun anymore. So over the course of those decades, the only time the general public sees a gun in mass is either on a law enforcement officer or a criminal. So they don't see the average person. Oh yeah, I know her, I know him. Yeah, it's fine. I go to the range, they do their thing, and they, whatever. They don't see that. So automatically you're trying to get over a hurdle that is artificially in place to start those discussions. Now, do you have, it doesn't matter what subject you're talking about, do you have the extremes? Yeah, you always have those, especially on social media. It can be brutal. It's always kind of a joke that, has anybody ever solved an argument on social media?
Yeah.
No.
Not yet.
And that's where we come in, and I handle things a lot differently than some of my colleagues around the country. Is if you truly want to have a conversation, I'm with you, but you have to know the facts. And I had a great talk years ago with a gentleman from Hong Kong, and he was in charge of their triad division, and it was an organized crime division of the Hong Kong police. And he said, in Hong Kong, we only deal with Chinese. We don't have Russian mafia. We don't have Turkish mafia, all these different cultures. And he says, the problem you have in America is not just crime, but each other. Your cultures are so different and your terminology is so different. If you're sitting down at the table and you're not using the same definitions, like firearm, just a simple thing like that, it's hopeless. Because you can't even agree on what the facts are before you even start the conversation.
That's true in just about everything today.
Everything.
Okay, we're all talking about finding fact-checked and checking this and checking that, and it goes all up and down the line.
Yeah, so it's become increasingly more difficult to have a conversation with the extremes on either side of any issue, kind of in control of the debate these days. And hey, I take a beating sometimes from my own members for sitting down at the table. I'll have those that there shouldn't be any negotiations, demand our rights back.
Right.
Well, that's not the way politics works in a free country.
Well, not in a democracy. It's not supposed to.
Well, thank God we don't have a true democracy.
Well, there you go. Town meeting.
Yeah.
So let's go back to the knee-jerk reaction is obviously things like banning the assault weapons. Okay. Now, I am maybe a little bit more informed about this because I did grow up in a family with guns and that kind of thing. There really isn't a definition even for assault weapons. That's been a political definition.
That was a political term that was brought up during the Clinton era.
Right.
It never existed prior.
It is a political term. It has nothing to do with the military history that defines what weapons are or manufacturers call or whatever. So let's just say the AR-15, which was, if I understand correctly, first used in Vietnam, and it's the first gun that was produced privately.
Not the AR-15. The AR-15 is the civilian version of the military version. The military version back then would have been the M16.
Oh, right, you are.
Yeah,
yes. And that was the one that was jamming.
All the time.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. That was the one that was jamming all the time.
Yeah.
Okay, so, but this gun, the AR-15, is one that was privately produced, and the government made a contract or created a contract with a private enterprise to go ahead. I think it was the first time that they did that. Why do you need one of those things?
Well, that to us, even to me, is a very dangerous question when somebody, not particularly a person, but the government, ask me, why do you need? Because once you start going down that road, it can get not a slippery slope, but a pretty steep cliff. So, but...
Explain why?
Well, I mean, you think of any scenario in life where the government can come in and say, do you really need that car? Wouldn't you be better off with this one? We can get you this one over here. You don't need that car. You know, all the way to the extremes. You don't really need to vote, do you? I mean, there are other people that can take care of that for you, so you don't really need to do that. It's not a question we should ever accept from our government, especially. As far as the gun itself goes, if it was a car, it's an antique, legitimately. It's older than I am. Not that old, but it's older than I am. It's been in the hands of civilians. The AR-15, which is the civilian version, has been in the hands of civilians for 60 years. The problem isn't the gun, it's the person. And if you look at, and they were absolutely catastrophic massacres, but if you look at the very small number of times that it has happened, it's always in the hands of somebody who's very mentally ill. There is argument, too, that some of them, like San Bernardino and Orlando, you could probably call those terrorist attacks, but you can go down that road. But if we take out those very small number of scenarios, we're not even talking about that gun.
What are we talking about?
We're not talking about anything. Because if they didn't happen, we're not even having those conversations.
Now, let me understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
So that if you ignore the ones that are founded or grounded in being a mental health issue, as opposed to whatever else it could be.
Yeah. Because they're not used in crime. They aren't. I mean, well, probably, 1/10 of 1% of whatever happens. So the bottom line is, again, circling back, the issue is mental health. It's not the gun. You put anything in the hands of somebody like that can cause massive carnage, okay.
But I know there are other guns other than, that look less violent than the AR-15 does. That can do what the AR-15 does. And
Right.
some would argue, I believe, that they can do it even better.
Well, the problem is, one of the misconceptions, too, is that people think, oh, it's such a high-powered gun. It's actually one of the smallest production center-fire cartridges out there.
Center-fired cartridges, let's explain that.
Center-fire cartridges, well, let's back up a step. Rim-fire cartridges, and they make bigger ones, but probably a lot of people know you go to summer camp, you shoot a .22, and a rim-fire cartridge is on the very rim, the firing pin strikes the very edge of and it goes off.
Yeah.
Centerfire has right in the middle of the cartridge at the base a primer, and the firing pin strikes that. And that's usually for bigger caliber guns. They did make rimfires for other things years ago, but not so much anymore. So if you look at a .223 cartridge, which is what these guns fire, it's basically the third of the size of a standard hunting cartridge, maybe a 30-06 or a .308. So when people talk about these as so powerful, they're not being mean, they're just uneducated. They don't know. I mean, one of the reasons they produced this was to wound and not kill in the military. So, I mean, the .223 in the hunting world is a rodent round. I mean, I don't know anybody that uses it for deer. I mean, probably somebody somewhere, but not nobody I know. So the problem is we get involved in a discussion about a gun that's 60 years old, that's been in our hands for those 60 years, and was never a problem until it got into the hands of somebody who was extraordinarily mentally ill. And unfortunately, what happens with these monsters is they see the press coverage the person before got.
Yeah, it builds.
And they're going to copycat whatever they did.
Yeah.
The exception is, fully admit, is Vegas. He's a ghost. And maybe that's what scares people more about him. These other massacres, you can point to something that was the root cause. We have nothing to point to with that guy. He's a ghost. We still don't know anything about him. So we kind of have to put that one in a separate pocket and go, okay, we need to figure that one out. But in these cases, if these people, should that have the Parkland kid been caught early in life? I guess he was to some extent. But the bottom line is, should they be walking around amongst us even with treatment? And that's going to be the hard part. Because if they're not walking amongst us, they don't have access to anything. Now, this is going to be hard.
Talk about civil rights against civil rights.
There you go. There's the problem. At what point do you tell? Well, I mean, it's like crime, right? Same thing. If you're convicted of X,
we take away your civil rights and lock you up.
Right.
Okay.
So if you're diagnosed with X, there should be at some point that we can agree that even people that are this, even if it's temporary, it has to be 24 hours a day, 365 for however long. So thinking about it as a civil rights discussion, I guess I still need to be convinced that it's okay to label the Second Amendment as a civil right and have it mean the same to me as access to education and access to, Well, if you think about it, especially in the Deep South, the Second Amendment was the only thing that saved a lot of lives because it was the only way they had to defend themselves. I mean, we go all the way back to it's called Crookshank case. It was the Colfax Courthouse Massacre. And that was just post-Civil War where they had 100 freedmen that were supposedly guarding a polling place. But they, legitimately only had the old muskets. And then the Klan rode in and killed them all. And, that's when the Deep South minorities learned very quickly, if we don't have something in the house to protect ourselves in the dead of night, we're going to be the next ones. So
right, let's go back. So who's the Deep South minorities? Are you saying, you're saying the Klan was the one that was acting as the
aggressor.
The aggressor against the freedmen who were standing there with muskets.
But they were just totally outgunned. That's when they learned that they have to have whatever is modern at the time to make sure they can defend themselves and legitimately. And normally it was a standard shotgun or something, but they had to be prepared for when somebody came to their home and tried to drag them out and kill them. So a lot of and this is a whole different discussion, but historically, a lot of the gun control laws originated in the Deep South to try to disarm the minorities. So for instance, some of the licensing laws were they had to get letters of reference from business people. And that was done intentionally because they knew that the minorities could not get those letters. So they weren't allowed to own a gun. So those are different arguments, but that's where the civil right comes into it, because the basic civil right to defend yourself and your family, this isn't because somebody stole your TV or whatever, or is in your shed stealing your chainsaw. It is legitimately to protect yourself. Now, if you look at one of our fastest growing demographics is women by far.
Yeah, I read that.
So it was interesting to talk to some women who come to our courses in the last 3 or 4 years. And I really would have thought that 9/11 would have changed a lot of minds, but it really didn't as far as Second Amendment goes. What changed a lot of minds were the storms. And because especially Sandy, Katrina, other storms like that, people realized that there are times when, oh my Lord, if I dial 911, nobody's coming because they can't. And even on the coast of New Jersey during Sandy, gangs were literally going house to house, breaking down doors, taking whatever they want, hurting people, because they knew they could. The police aren't coming; they can't. Katrina, look how many people had to get together just to protect their neighborhoods. Yeah. So when you look at a systemic breakdown of government to protect you, it is absolutely a civil right, because without that, there's nothing else.
Okay, so I know one of the statistics out there is that 2/3 of those gun owners, the 350 million guns that are out there, okay, they're 2/3 of the people who own those guns do it for protection. And I think that if there were a way to refocus the whole thing around that one statement, fact, whatever, okay, I think it might reframe the whole thing, because for the person who never carries a gun, never wanted to carry a gun, is scared to death to carry a gun and so forth, you need to understand how it feels to be, that person feeling vulnerable for whatever reason. It doesn't matter what the reason is. I think that if we started talking about the vulnerability from both sides, because that's what you're coming down to. I'm carrying a gun because I feel scared without it. you're not carrying a gun because you feel scared about that same gun. Now, I want to take that gun away from you because you're scaring me. Knowing you have that scares me.
Yeah.
And I believe that people are legitimately scared on both sides.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, you know, and one of the things, as a matter of fact, it's a hot topic now, arming teachers. We've talked to a lot of people about it, and we have been, ever since Newtown, goal has been consistent. If the administration is okay with it and the individual teacher is okay with it and there's some training involved, we can have that conversation. We absolutely do not want to force anybody to carry a gun. Because if you're not comfortable carrying, bad things can happen.
You're as dangerous as anybody.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we tell people that when they take courses from us too, not just teachers, but everybody. Listen, take the course, learn the safety, but before you carry, make sure you're ready to carry. And there are circumstances too. We had a board member, this 10, 12 years ago, got caught up in a convenience store robbery in Worcester. And Jim, he's unfortunately gone now, but Jim makes me look like a little tiny guy. He was huge. And a history teacher. Police show up after the robbery. He went to identify himself right away, say, "Officer, I just want to let you know I'm carrying. Here's my ID." And the officer said, "Well, why didn't you stop it?" "I'm not going to take a life for $50 in a cash register." And that's who we really are. You know, we teach people, especially those who carry, will go out of their way to avoid a situation because they know the implications. You don't hear of gunfights with lawful gun owners. You just don't, because we know better. And we know that the gun is the very, very last option. You know, and you've got to be serious. If you're not ready to take a life in defense of life, don't carry. Don't carry, period. So I understand why people can be nervous, and a lot of it's unknown. And that's why, especially for women, it's a national course, but we help run. It's called Women on Target. And it's just a day at the range for women. We try to get as many women instructors as we can. Some will never own a gun. They just want to get over that fear. What is it? It's something strange. I don't know what it is. And it always helps, too, occasionally when we have our junior shooters come and help.
And do it.
You know, they're 14, 15 years old, and they're like, this is not, treat it safely, respect it, do everything you're supposed to do, just like, well, I wouldn't say just like a car, but...
But in a way, it is, you know, I mean, you know, a car's pretty dangerous. The guy down in, what was it, Charlottesville?
You know, and I was shocked at this when I looked at the state numbers. Remember I said we lose about 2 a year to gun accidents, those usually are criminals? Massachusetts alone, we lose 350 to 400 on our highways a year. That's amazing. That's 300 to 400 people dead on our highways every year. And I always kind of joke with people that, you know, well, guns are dangerous. Well, if you come to one of our ranges and you see a sign that says no texting and shooting, then come out and talk to me, you know.
Well, there's that, I must say, yeah. Well, I hope that this at least, you know, will help us here in Holliston to sort of lay a groundwork for conversation. And I may be calling you to invite you back to see if we can move to the next step to at least... Yeah. My goal is, as I say, just to get the conversation started, but to be a conversation, not a battle. I know that there are lots of people who believe in registration, and that it sounds like that should be one of the easier things to do. Aside from the civil rights issues involved, registration, I mean, we've had it in Massachusetts, I think, for long guns since the 60s. Yeah. Never solved a single crime. Yeah. So what are we doing it for? I mean, and that's, again, going back to Canada, where they spent billions doing it, and they realized it was a complete waste of time. Yeah. So registration's tough because of the tracking of it. Yep. You know, if you have a gun that's stolen or something like that, then the chain stops. Well, the bigger thing to me is the 350 million guns that are already out there. Right. You know, and not including the illegal. Right. Yeah. And no matter what we do today, is that solution addressing that problem? You know, because short of having the Army, the Navy, the Coast Guard, and everybody go door to door to confiscate guns, a la some other regimes in the world, you know, there's no way to know. There's no way to get them. Well, it's you know, I know we're probably getting close to time. We are. One of the things I talked to a sociology class about in Suffolk was, and it was just to start a conversation,
when they were asking me about mandatory background checks, and I primed them with, I want you to start looking at this in a different way than you're usually doing. I go, okay, well, why do we need background checks? And they said, well, there's dangerous people out there. Okay, so how do background checks work? Oh, well, if you have a record, a mental health record, or a criminal record, the government, okay, so we know who these people are. Well, yeah, okay. Here's a question, and I just wanted the class to address it from a whole different angle. Why are we okay as a society with people walking amongst us that we don't trust with a gun? Wow, did that change their whole perspective on it? And I'm not saying permanent incarceration for everybody, but it was a whole different discussion than people are used to having. And it's like, well, maybe you've got something there. If I don't trust you with a gun, why am I letting you, go
practice
to
medicine or whatever?
Anything, yeah.
Or
I mean, go to
right.
college with my daughter.
Yeah.
That was a subject I brought up because of the college campus violence.
Yeah.
I said, well, why don't colleges do background checks for applicants? Wow, people started screaming at me on that one. And I said, no, wait a minute.
It's a legitimate question.
I mean, people are coming from all around the world. You don't know who these people are.
And you're putting them all together in one little space and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a whole big civil rights issue right there.
Mm-hmm.
It has nothing to do with guns.
Yeah.
All right, so we've opened the can of worms. And we are going to continue the discussions today's conversation with Jim. Thanks very much. I really appreciate your schlepping down here from Newburyport.
Yes.
And
well, there's heat here, so there's heat in the building.
Yeah, there's heat and electricity.
Yeah.
All right, but thank you very much, and catch us again. We're going to keep this conversation going. And if you do comment on Facebook, I hope it will be with a spirit of an open mind, open heart, and civility.
Civility.
Thank you. Thanks. See you next time.